The morning my mother told me we couldn't afford new school shoes, my sister walked downstairs in a pair of white leather Valentino sneakers she hadn't worn yet. I was 14. I said nothing. I had learned by then, that saying something only made things worse. That was 25 years ago. Last spring, I found a DNA test in my mother's filing cabinet, sealed, dated, and addressed to a laboratory in Geneva. My name was on it, Inthe. So was a man's name I had never heard spoken in my life. My mother had known the results for 25 years. She had kept them in a hanging file between her mortgage statements and her car insurance. She had filed them carefully, which told me everything about what kind of woman she is. Not careless, not chaotic, deliberate. Everything she ever did to me, she did on purpose. Stay with me, because what I found in that file didn't just answer a question. It unraveled an entire architecture of lies and gave me the legal standing to dismantle it. My name is Serena. I am 39 years old. I am a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Toronto. I am precise by training and by temperament, which is probably why, when my world collapsed last spring, I responded by building a spreadsheet. I grew up in a house in Oakville, Ontario, the kind of suburb where the lawns are kept and the curtains match, and nobody talks about money directly, though money is, in fact, the subject of almost every conversation. My mother is a woman named Patricia. My sister, 4 years older than me, is named Vivian. My father, the man I believed to be my father for the first 38 years of my life, was named Gerald. He died 16 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to end. He was 64. From the outside, we were a family of four in a 4-bedroom house with a double garage and a backyard pool. From the inside, we were something considerably more complicated. The clothes are where I always start when I try to explain my childhood to people who didn't witness it, because the clothes were visible. Undeniable. Evil. The kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away or reframed. Vivienne wore designers from the time she was 8 or 9. Not occasionally, consistently. Burberry trench coats. Ralph Lauren dresses for family occasions. Later, as a teenager, Moschino Versace things I didn't know the names of at the time but understood were expensive, by the way other girls looked at her when she walked into a room. I wore what my mother described as practical clothing, jeans, from a department store, t-shirts in multi-packs, one winter coat per season, chosen for warmth rather than appearance, in colors that didn't show dirt. When I was 11, a girl at school asked me why my sister dressed so differently from me. I told her we had different tastes. That was the answers I had assembled for myself, because no other answer had been offered. I want to be clear that the disparity was not limited to clothing. That's simply where it was most visible. Vivienne had a credit card at 16. I was given a $10 weekly allowance that stopped when I turned 15, at which point my mother told me I was old enough to earn my own money. I began babysitting that same month. I worked every weekend through high school. I found it clarifying. In retrospect, working taught me that I was capable of providing for myself, which turned out to be a skill I would need. Vivienne's university tuition, residence, and living expenses were paid entirely by my parents. For my own university, I received a single conversation with my father in which he explained that money was tight and that a student loan was the responsible path for someone of my abilities. I took the loan. I paid it off in 6 years. I was proud of that for a long time before I understood that I had been made to pay for something that had already been given freely to someone else. My father's illness arrived without warning, the way pancreatic cancer almost always does. He was fine in September. He was diagnosed in November. He was gone in January. I flew home immediately and stayed for 3 weeks. During that time, something shifted in the atmosphere of my mother's house. Not grief exactly, not yet, but a kind of alertness. Used to be. The way people move when they know a reckoning is approaching. And they are quietly calculating what it will cost them. My mother was attentive to Vivian during those weeks, in a way that felt heightened even by their usual standard. They whispered together in the kitchen. They took walks. Once, passing the hallway, even, I heard my mother say to Vivienne, "We'll make sure it's right." When I appeared, they stopped speaking. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was grieving. I was exhausted. Iba. I was reading meaning into ordinary moments because grief distorts perception. I was not being paranoid. My father died on a Tuesday morning in January. I held his hand at the end, which surprised me, that I was there, Ibi, that I wanted to be, that it mattered to me despite everything. Whatever he had done or failed to do as a father, he was still the only father I had known. You grieve the relationship you wished you'd had as much as the one you actually had. Sometimes more. The will was read 6 weeks after the funeral. I drove to Oakville from Toronto on a gray February morning, which felt appropriate. My father's estate was not modest. He had spent 30 years in commercial real estate. The house in Oakville was owned outright. There were investment accounts, Peen. A commercial property in Hamilton he had purchased in 2003 and never sold. A life insurance policy. The distributions was as follows: the primary residence, and 70% of liquid assets to my mother, Giban. The Hamilton property, valued at approximately $1.2 million, to Vivienne. A sum of $40,000, presented, I would later reflect, with the energy of someone leaving a tip, to me, Kiwi. I sat in the lawyer's office and kept my face still. I am good at keeping my face still. It is a skill that serves me well in finance, Giebel, where showing your reaction to a number before you've processed it is considered a liability, $40,000, against a $1.2 million property and a house worth twice that. I drove home. I did not cry. I opened my laptop and looked at the numbers for a long time. 2 months passed. I returned to work. I functioned, which is what I do, Geepy. But something had shifted in a way I couldn't name precisely. A loosening of something I had kept tightly managed for years. You. The question I had been living alongside my entire life without fully articulating it had become suddenly impossible to ignore. Why? Not why had they left me less. Not why had Vivienne always been chosen, Iba. But the deeper question beneath those, the one I had been too frightened to ask since I was 8 years old, standing in a department store, holding a multi-pack of t-shirts, while my mother and sister disappeared into the designer section. Why was I always the exception? Why was I always the one for whom the rules were different? I had hypotheses. I had run through them over the years with the systematic efficiency of someone trained to analyze risk. I was less charming than Vivienne. Possible, though it had never been confirmed. I was more independent, which perhaps made me seem less in need. Plausible, and a narrative my parents had certainly promoted. I reminded my mother of someone she didn't like. I reminded my father of something he didn't want to face. That last one had always sat slightly apart from the others. Geetsy. A hypothesis had never examined him too closely because the implications of it were large. I went back to Oakville in April, 3 months after the will reading, to help my mother sort through my father's things. Vivienne was supposed to come, but canceled the morning of. Something with her children. And so it was just the two of us, my mother and I, moving through a dead man's possessions in the particular silence that exists between people who have never quite known what to say to each other. My father's filing cabinet was in the basement. 2 drawers of a 4-drawer unit were personal documents, house records, insurance, medical. He had been organized. I worked through the files methodically, setting aside what could be discarded and flagging what my mother should keep. The hanging file was near the back of the second drawer, behind a folder of RRSP statements from 2003. The tab read, in my father's handwriting, correspondence. Personal. Inside were 3 items. A letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, dated 2019, Inchusi. A handwritten note in my mother's handwriting that I didn't read closely enough to understand before I saw the third item. A sealed envelope from a genetic testing laboratory in Geneva, Guin. The return address was printed in small gray text. In the recipient field, my mother's name. In the reference field, standard for these documents, I would later learn. Two names listed as test subjects, my name, Ipa, and a man's name I had never seen before. Marcus Adeyemi. The envelope had been opened. The results were inside. I stood in my father's basement and read them in the fluorescent light of a room that smelled of old paper and motor oil. The test had been conducted 25 years ago, EB. I was 14 when my mother sent our DNA to a laboratory in Switzerland and received confirmation of something she had apparently suspected or already known. Gerald was not my biological father. Marcus Adeyemi was. Eep. I put the document back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in the folder. I closed the filing cabinet. I went upstairs and told my mother I had finished the basement and needed to get back to Toronto, either. She offered me coffee. I said no. I drove home. I know how this sounds. People always want the confrontation to happen immediately. They want the accusation in the kitchen, the tears, the raised voices, the dramatic accounting. I understand that impulse. I simply don't operate that way. I never have. What I did when I got back to my apartment, Ibiza, was sit down at my kitchen table with a notepad and write down everything I knew, everything I could verify, everything that required further investigation. I approached it the way I approach a financial discrepancy at work, with the understanding that the story the numbers are telling you is almost never the complete story, and that reacting before you have the full picture is how people make expensive mistakes. Then I called my therapist and told her I needed an emergency session the following morning. I want to say that because I think it matters. I did not handle what came next alone. I was not stoic to the point of self-destruction. I sought support. I cried eventually, not that night, but in my therapist's office the following morning, in a way that felt like something structural giving way rather than anything as simple as sadness. Then I went back to work. And I began, methodically, to find out who Marcus Adeyemi was. He was not difficult to find. A name that distinctive, in the era of LinkedIn and professional directories, yields results quickly. Marcus Adeyemi was 63 years old. He had been born in Lagos and had come to Canada in his 20s to study engineering. He had built a career in infrastructure development. He lived in Vancouver. He had been married for 31 years to a woman named Catherine. He had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, all adults. He had an open LinkedIn profile with a professional photograph. I looked at it for a long time. I have my mother's mouth. I have always known this. The same narrow upper lip, the same particular set to the jaw. But my cheekbones, my forehead, heaped. The specific architecture of my face above the cheekbones. I had always assumed these were from some distant branch of my father's family. Some recessive gene expressing itself unexpectedly. They were not. I looked at Marcus Adeyemi's photograph for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk that lasted approximately 2 hours, during which I did not think about anything clearly but felt the shape of the new information settling into me, rearranging things, displacing what had been there before. I retained a lawyer the following week. Not for the estate challenge, not yet. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with, legally and personally, before I could decide what to do with it. My lawyer, Guian, a woman named Diana who specializes in family law and estate disputes, listened to the full account without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Whether I had access to the document, whether I could prove its authenticity, whether I intended to pursue genetic testing of my own to assist independent verification. I told her yes, yes, and yes. She told me that if the biological paternity could be verified, I had a credible basis to challenge the estate distribution on grounds that my exclusion had been structured around a false premise. Specifically, that I had been treated throughout my life as a lesser dependent based on a fact my parents had concealed from me, and that this concealment had informed not only how I was raised but how I was provided for at the time of death. She also told me that these cases are emotionally expensive, regardless of outcome. She said it not to discourage me, but because she believed in informed consent. I told her I was a financial analyst. I understood cost-benefit ratios. She smiled and said that was not quite what she meant. She was right, of course. It was not quite what she meant. I conducted my own DNA test, a reputable service, with results that could be used as corroborating evidence if needed. I already knew what the results would show before they arrived. But I needed it documented. I needed something that was mine, that no one had hidden, that had been undertaken with my full knowledge and consent. While I waited for results, I wrote a letter to Marcus Adeyemi. I have written many difficult documents in my professional life, EC. Analyses delivered to boards that would rather not hear what the numbers say. Reports recommending the dissolution of partnerships that had been treated as permanent. I have a high tolerance for difficult writing. This letter was harder than any of them. I did not know how to begin, so I simply began the facts. My name, my age, my mother's name, and the city where she had lived in the late 1980s, around the time he would have known her, the existence of the document, my recent DNA test, and, at the end, a single question, not an accusation, not a demand. A question, did you know about me? I sent it by email, to an address listed on his firm's archived contact page. I did not know if it would reach him. I did not know if he would respond. I knew that sending it was the right thing to do, regardless of what came back. Keeper. He responded in 4 days. The email was longer than I expected, and more careful. He confirmed that he had known my mother briefly in the late 1980s. They had met through mutual friends in Toronto, Idibia. Had a relationship that lasted several months before he relocated to Vancouver for a contract position. He said that my mother had told him, when he left, that there was nothing he needed to concern himself with. He had understood this as a statement about the relationship, not about a pregnancy. He had not known about me. He said that he needed time to speak with his family before any further contact. He said that he hoped I would allow him that. He said that receiving my email had, and I am paraphrasing, rearranged his understanding of the past 39 years. I wrote back and told him I understood. I told him to take whatever time he needed. I appreciated his honesty more than I could easily express. I had braced for denial. I had prepared, in the quiet, analytical section of my mind, for a man who would dispute the facts, challenge the documentation, protect his existing life at the cost of acknowledging mine. What I received instead was a man who, when confronted with a truth he had not chosen, chose to face it. That meant something to me. It still does. My DNA results arrived. They confirmed what the Geneva document had shown 25 years ago. Gerald was not my biological father. The test also indicated a high probability of paternal lineage, matching the ethnic markers consistent with Marcus Adeyemi's heritage. I brought the results to Diana. We began preparing the estate challenge in earnest. The legal argument rested on several pillars. First, that I had been raised as a dependent of Gerald and Patricia throughout my entire childhood, and that this dependency carried legal weight regardless of biological relation. Second, Bizzati, that the dramatic disparity in how I was provided for relative to my sister during childhood and at the time of estate distribution reflected a discriminatory treatment rooted in a fact I had not been permitted to know. Third, that the concealment of the DNA test, conducted when I was 14 and kept from me for 25 years, constituted a deliberate suppression of information that affected my legal and personal rights. This third argument was, Diana said, the most complex. Concealment of parentage is not, in itself, automatically actionable. But in the context of an estate challenge, the pattern of conduct it revealed, the lifelong disparity, the document's existence, the contents of my father's will, formed a picture that was difficult to dismiss. We filed the challenge in August. My mother retained her own lawyer within the week. I want to talk about Vivienne, because any account of this that doesn't grapple with her is incomplete. Vivienne and I have never been close. That is perhaps obvious, given everything. But we were not hostile either, not overtly. We occupied a kind of careful distance that I think we both understood, without ever articulating it, was the only safe way to exist in the same family. She got what she got. I got what I got. We did not talk about it. When the estate challenge was filed, my mother told Vivienne. I know this because Vivienne called me 2 days later. The call was not what I expected, Eva. I had prepared for anger, for accusation, for a defense of my mother and of the inheritance she stood to have complicated by my legal action. What I got was silence for a long moment, and then Vivienne asking me very quietly, "Did you know?" Before the will, I told her about the filing cabinet, the envelope, the name, another silence, And then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't know it was a something. I thought it was a someone. I thought it was you, Hina. I asked her what she meant. She said that she had spent her childhood believing I was difficult, that my mother had given her, consistently and over many years, the impression that I was a complicated child who required a different kind of handling, that the disparity, the clothes, the money, the attention, had been framed to her as a response to my nature rather than a decision my parents had made. She had believed it. She was not stupid for believing it. She was a child, and then a young woman, and then an adult, who had never been given a reason to question the story she'd been told. She had been, in her own way, also lied to. This did not resolve everything between us, then. It did not collapse 25 years of distance into warmth overnight, but it changed something. It placed the weight where it belonged. Not between us, but above us. With the people who had constructed the story we had both been living inside. Vivienne did not intervene in the legal process. She did not testify for my mother. She also did not testify for me. She remained, as she described it in our second conversation, in the middle, not because she lacked conviction, but because she was also processing information that had restructured her own understanding of her life. I respected that, I still do. The mediation process lasted 4 months. I will not detail every step, both because some of it remains confidential, and because the procedural mechanics are less important than what they produced, either. What I can tell you is that my mother, at no point during the process, apologized. She acknowledged, through her legal representation, that the DNA test had existed, and that it had been kept from me. She did not acknowledge this as wrong. The framing, delivered in careful legal language, was that the decision had been made in my best interest and in the interest of family stability. I sat across a mediation table from that framing and felt something I can only describe as a final settling. Not peace exactly, not closure, which is a word I distrust, but a kind of completion of a question I had been carrying since I was 8 years old, with a multiplaque of T-shirts in a department store. I had not been kept from the truth for my benefit. I had been kept from the truth because the truth was inconvenient for everyone except me. And I had been the one assigned to carry that inconvenience, silently and without explanation, for 38 years. The settlement gave me a significantly restructured portion of the estate. B. The Hamilton property was not transferred. That would have required Vivienne's involvement, and I had no wish to pursue it in a way that penalized her. What I received was a financial settlement, drawn from liquid assets, that reflected something considerably closer to equity. It was not everything. It was enough. My mother and I do not speak. That is her choice as much as mine. I sent her a letter after the settlement was signed, that was neither accusatory nor conciliatory. I simply told her that I understood, now, the full shape of what had happened, and that I did not intend to spend any further energy managing her discomfort about it. I told her I wished her well. I meant it, in the flat, depleted way one means things when all the feeling has already been spent. She did not respond. Marcus Adeyemi and I have met in person once. He came to Toronto in October, 7 months after my first email to him. We met at a restaurant I chose, in a neighborhood I knew well, at a time of day I controlled. I did not do this to be cold. I did it because I understood that I needed to feel safe for the conversation to be honest. He brought his wife. I had not expected that, but I was glad. Eben. Catherine Adeyemi is a forthright woman with a background in public health. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "We're glad you found us." I had been composed until that moment. Marcus and I talked for 3 hours. He told me about his life. I told him about mine. He told me he had 3 children and that all of them knew, now, that there was a fourth. He said the responses had varied. His eldest daughter had cried. His son, had asked for time. His youngest daughter had immediately searched for me on LinkedIn, which made me laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. He asked me what I needed from him, if anything. You will see. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I had spent so long managing deficits that I was still learning how to receive things that were simply offered without strings. He said he understood that. He said that was fine. He said there was no timeline. I found that I believed him. I want to say something, near the end of this, about the clothes. Not because they are the most important part of the story. They are not, either. But because they were the most visible part, and because I think visibility matters. The Valentino sneakers my sister wore, on the morning my mother told me we couldn't afford school shoes. I never forgot them. Yuppie. For years I carried that image as a symbol of something I couldn't name. Proof of a hierarchy I didn't understand. Evidence of a difference I had no framework for. Now I understand it differently. My mother dressed Vivian in designers because Vivian was Gerald's daughter, and Gerald was her husband, and the architecture of that family required a certain performance of wholeness. She dressed me in multipacks and hand-me-downs not because money was scarce. It wasn't. But because I was the part of the story she hadn't planned for. The evidence of something that had happened before Gerald. The child who, if looked at too closely, raised questions she had no interest in answering. The clothes were not about clothes. They were about what I represented. And what I represented was a truth she had decided, before I was old enough to have any say in it, that no one would be allowed to know. I think about that child sometimes. The 8-year-old standing in the department store, me. The 14-year-old watching her sister come downstairs in white leather sneakers. The 38-year-old standing in a basement under fluorescent light, holding an envelope that had been filed carefully between mortgage statements and car insurance. She deserved better. She deserved the truth. She deserved to be fed from the same table as everyone else. Not because of what the food cost, but because of what it meant to be included. To be counted. To be someone whose hunger was worth acknowledging. He has it now. Not the childhood that cannot be revised, but the truth. And the standing to say, I was here, I was always here, and I was always worth more than what I was given. I speak to Marcus once a month, keen. We are figuring out what we are to each other slowly, in the careful way that adult relationships built on unexpected foundations require. His youngest daughter, my half-sister, Ipal, a word I am still getting used to, sent me a message last month asking if I liked hiking. I told her I had never tried it. She said she would take me in the spring. I have that to look forward to. Gitna. My own DNA results are framed on the wall of my home office. Not the report itself, the graph, the visual representation of heritage, markers and percentages and origins I had never known to claim. I had it framed because I wanted something on my wall that was entirely true, that had never been managed, or hidden, or filed carefully behind someone else's financial records. Some mornings I look at it before I start work. I find it clarifying. I am 39 years old. I know who I am. I know where I come from. And I know, with the particular certainty of someone who has assembled truth from pieces that were deliberately scattered, that neither of those things was ever my parents to withhold. They withheld them anyway. That is, the injury. But I am the one still standing, And I find, more mornings than not, that that is enough, either. If any part of this story sits with you, if you have lived in a household where the rules were different for you and no one ever explained why, I want you to know that your instinct that something was wrong was not paranoia. It was perception. Subscribe if you want to stay. There's more to come. And if you are navigating a family legal situation and don't know where to begin, the resources in the description below are a place to start. I'll see you next time.